Tanya Das from the Bipartisan Policy Center lead this discussion. So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Tanya. Thanks so much for being here, guys.
All right, good morning, everyone. This is going to be a really fun panel. We have a fantastic group of experts here this morning. My name is Tanya Das. I'm a director with the Energy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I'm very excited to be leading this discussion, talking all about what we can expect going into next Congress from an energy policy perspective. And I'm going to kick things off by introducing my fellow panelists. So first off, we have Ryan Abraham, who is a principal in EY's Washington Counsel Ernst Young practice, where he provides services to clients all across industries in a wide variety of domestic and international tax policies. Previously, Ryan spent 14 years at the Senate Finance Committee, including under current ranking member Ron Wyden. Over the last decade, he served as a key staffer on a variety of tax reform proposals that were developed by the Finance Committee, culminating in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. He developed Democratic caucus initiatives on energy and infrastructure tax reform. And also, I think that should be not ranking member, but Chair Ron Wyden. It's all good. And next up, we have Beth Viola, who's a senior policy advisor in Holland Knight's Public Policy and Regulatory Group and is the chair of the firm's Energy and Natural Resources Group. Beth has decades of experience in climate change and energy policy. She advises a range of corporate clients, coalitions, and industry associations on public policy related to greenhouse gas emissions reductions and the transition to a low-carbon economy, including funding and deployment of clean energy and innovative technologies. Beth also sits on the board of the National Wildlife Federation. Welcome, Beth. Next up, we have Emily Domenech, who is a senior vice president at Boundary Stone Partners and leads Republican engagement for the firm. Emily served 10 years in the House of Representatives, including as a senior policy advisor to 3 speakers of the House and as a staff on the House Science Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Her key accomplishments are innumerable and many, but to name a few, they include managing the GOP Energy, Climate, and Conservation Task Force, leading the drafting, development, and passage of H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act, and serving as lead negotiator for the House on NEPA reform. Prior to her work on Capitol Hill, Emily held political appointee positions at the Department of Energy and Department of Defense. She's also the co-founder of the Honor Project, which honors fallen service members annually on Memorial Day, and she currently serves as a U.S. Navy Reserve officer. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Kellie Donnelly, who's the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Lot 16. Prior to this role, she spent 17 years in various roles on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, including under the leadership of Chair Murkowski. Most recently, she was there as Chief Counsel. During her time in the Senate, she provided counsel on all energy policy and federal land management issues within the committee's vast jurisdiction. She also helped negotiate, draft, and enact everything from major legislative packages and budget reconciliation measures to targeted provisions and standalone bills. Welcome, Kellie. All right. Well, as you can hear, we have decades and decades of experience amongst these 4 folks on the stage today across a whole host of important issues: appropriations, tax policy, authorization, just everything. So I know we're going to have an interesting conversation here today. Ryan, I want to kick things off with you. So we know that this big bill called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is expiring next year. With the expiration of many provisions in that bill, Congress is going to have to move a tax bill. How do you expect that the clean energy tax credits will be in play? And what advice do you have for the clean energy community about protecting their tax priorities?
Okay, yeah, so I have 41 minutes left, so this will be perfect.
Oh, God.
So in 2017, the signature of fiscal policy, right, of the Trump administration was this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The problem is that it was done under reconciliation, and the vast majority of it, at least on the individual side, expires at the end of next year. And the total price tag of that legislation is $4.6 trillion. Now, if the Trump administration, or if we have a new Trump administration, they're going to want to extend that entire bill. Plus, they'd want to have some new policies, right, in there, things like exempting like tips from taxation and other things like that. So that price tag might even go higher. If there's a Harris administration, the plan would be not to extend the entire bill, but only for those earning $400,000 or less, or sort of pick an income that Democrats would say is sort of a middle-class family, or but it's still going to be 97% if it's 400,000 of Americans, and you're talking still a $2.5 trillion bill. Plus, the Harris administration is going to want to do things like affordable housing and kind of this laundry list. We saw this with the Build Back Better agenda when Democrats were in charge. So again, it's just a huge price tag on this bill. And not to get into the nuts and bolts of what all that is, it means tax increases for Americans. And whether it's Democrats or Republicans, it's going to cost a lot of money to fix that. We also have, right, as we know, all of these incentives, and we do most of our energy policy through the tax code now, or at least on the clean energy incentive side. We have a bill that originally cost around $300 billion, now being rescored by the Joint Committee on Taxation as over $600 billion. And then as part of the new CBO baseline in February of this year, costing over $700 billion. Outside estimates put the cost of these policies at maybe over $1 trillion. So, it was passed in a reconciliation bill. Republicans across the board voted against it, right? Not all the policies in the bill are made equal, but if you're Republicans looking at ways to pay for $4.6 trillion plus of tax cuts, it's going to be the IRA as one of the policies to go after. And there's a lot of revenue there, right? That, eliminating certain incentives, phasing out policies early. This has been one of the campaign talking points, right? I'm not breaking any news with that. How that would play out in reality, right? I'm sure we'll get into, right? Is going to be very different than campaign messages, in my opinion. But if we have a blue wave election, right? Like Democrats are not going to go after it. If anything, they'll want to do more, right, when it comes to clean energy policy. And in divided government, it'll be it's very unclear, right, where members of Congress in a divided government would agree on how to address this looming fiscal cliff, taxmageddon, whatever you want to call it, with this huge multi-trillion-dollar tax bill. Are clean energy policies still in play? Are there issues around the edges, like, expanding foreign entity of concern rules, which we've already seen bipartisan support for, and raises some revenue, right? Not a lot, but is that even just put out there as sort of an olive branch or a fig leaf to sort of, to show there's something in the energy space? So kind of trying to sort of answer the question, kind of giving a broad lay of the land of how I think the members are going to think about clean energy in the context of the TCJA expiration next year. And as far as what this community should be doing, I think a lot of the work is already being done. I think as Treasury has put out the guidance to help companies understand exactly what the law says, right? We're seeing tons of new investment, right? Tons of job creation, and of course, that needs to be communicated to the Hill. Democrats are going to support this policy, right? They view it as one of the signature accomplishments to address climate change, right? They're going to be fine, but talking in red states, red districts, right, about the importance of these incentives, right, is going to be important, because those members are going to face this difficult decision of, well, I get maybe there's some jobs here, but am I going to let taxes go up, right? If I don't pass this TCJA, where's that balance? So I think there's a lot of work there to be done.
Thanks, Ren. Yeah, I think that was a great framing, where we have TCJA that was passed by reconciliation and IRA that was also passed by reconciliation, and they're coming to a head next year, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation. You also laid out how corporations are benefiting from a lot of the IRA tax incentives and really need to be going up to the hill talking about, how they are benefiting from that and how they are helping to bring economic benefits to the states that they're investing in. And turning now to Beth, you work with a lot of those corporations, and a lot of your clients come from the industrial sector. And you've been a veteran of many legislative and policy energy battles. In the past 4 years, we've seen so much movement on the legislative side through IRA, IIJ, and CHIPS. And these bills have fundamentally shifted the government's approach to addressing climate change and industrial policy. So what do your energy and climate-focused clients want from the next Congress and administration?
Thanks so much for having me. First of all, everyone keeps saying decades and a veteran. Does that make me old?
I don't like it either.
I don't like it at all. It's cumulatively we are. But look, I think like everybody on this stage, we are representing a broad, diverse group of companies and technologies that are working to make this transition to a low carbon economy. And I'd say there's a couple of things that they all, across the board, all feel like they need. The first is, no surprise, certainty. Everyone is incredibly concerned about, the number one question I'm sure we all get is, what happens after this election? I think people are incredibly anxious, especially those that have gotten a lot of federal dollars from the IRA, from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and CHIPS. We've got a dedicated team of folks that have secured more than $4 billion just from the IRA and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and grants. And those clients are really anxious. What happens if we have a Trump administration? Are those dollars going to get put on hold? Are they going to be rescinded? Obviously, real concerns about the tax credits. Just across the board, this sense of uncertainty. And when you have industries that are putting up billions and billions more to match the billions that this government is investing, it gives them a lot of pause. I'd say the second C is clarity. They absolutely still feel the need for greater clarity on a number of things. We do have a lot of tax guidance, but a lot of it is also really unclear. You look at things like we still don't have clarity on what 45Z on the hydrogen is going to look like. And again, you've got billions of dollars that the government's committed to create these hydrogen hubs. You look at the low carbon fuel and tax incentive 45Z, and that tax guidance was as clear as mud and created more questions. And we're probably not going to see final guidance on some of these things until next year. So you add the election and the uncertainty around that to it, and it really does, again, give companies a lot of pause. And also meaning they want to think about, okay, so how do we go about extending the existing credits that exist if we don't know what that one's going to look like? And I would say the third thing generally is cha-ching. That's my third C. They all want more money. So, but there are a lot of programs that are incredibly oversubscribed, like 48C and the industrial decarb money. And, we saw a lot of amazing projects come out of those. We're in the middle of the next round of 48C, but that one and done pot from industrial decarb was really oversubscribed, and there's still so many other amazing projects that could be funded out of that. So I'd say certainty, clarity, and cha-ching.
That's a great list. Emily, turning to you now, for the last decade, which is only a comment on your amount of experience and not a comment on your age,
Oh, God.
you have been at the center of congressional conversations on energy and climate policy in the House. How has the conversation on Republican energy and climate priorities changed in this time, especially under current Speaker Johnson? And what energy priorities do you think will be top of mind for House Republicans next year?
So this is a big question, and I realized that I needed to highlight this in my bio, but I worked on the Energy Act years ago, before it was even called the Energy Act, with Tanya, so I always love coming back to my Science Committee roots here. So in terms of where House Republicans are and sort of where they started, I want to sort of go back to my time on the Science Committee with Chairman Frank Lucas, who basically sort of said, look, we need to get away from this knee-jerk, rhetoric-driven response to talking about climate and clean energy because it distracts from all of the good policies that we have in place that we support. And he basically started, when he came in as ranking member on the Science Committee, with how do we get folks not to say the same things, because every district is different and every district has different resources and different stakeholders, but how do we get everybody at least talking off the same sheet of talking points so they're not contradicting each other or pushing back against each other. And that effort really took, particularly the Science Committee, but took some of our members from these really, really red, like R+20 districts and got them to a place where they were comfortable talking about how US natural gas is cleaner, how we have lower emissions here in the US, and how we end up better competing with China when we rely on cleaner American resources. Those sorts of things are really themes that brought together House Republicans, and it's part of why I ended up going to work for Speaker McCarthy when he was minority leader, because he wanted to do that effort with the whole Republican conference. The outgrowth, I think, of that leadership from folks like McCarthy, from Lucas, from Garrett Graves, and other members who wanted to really lean in on this issue is the growth of the Conservative Climate Caucus. John Curtis gets a ton of credit for being willing to not just convene members, but to get to talk to members who are not often comfortable talking about clean energy and getting them to come to events and participate. That's the second largest caucus in the Republican Party now. It came from the GOP Energy, Climate, and Conservation Task Force, which was a part of building our platform before we took the majority. And we see it now where we have big committees making an effort to focus on environment and climate as a big part of their platform. They named subcommittees with the word climate in them. That's the kind of stuff that we wouldn't have expected from Republicans a long time ago. So I think it's a big shift. But the important thing to remember here is that it's a shift in how we talk about this issue, not necessarily the policies we support. Republicans have always systematically supported investments in research and development. They've supported the national labs, they've supported our universities, and they've supported making sure we get the government out of the way of allowing people to innovate and build in the United States. Those are all really fundamental Republican ideas that haven't changed in that time frame. Just the things that have changed is how we frame it and how we put it forward and how we communicate that to the American people. Going forward into the next Congress, we talked a little bit about like our various reconciliation battles in blue wave, red wave territory, and I find that a little less interesting than the sort of mixed bag of what we could get in divided government, since I think that's a more likely election outcome. So I kind of want to hit on three things real quickly that I think will be priorities regardless of who's in the White House, and if we're in a sort of split environment. Number one, I think it will surprise no one here that I think permitting will continue to be at the top of the list. This is something that brings, again, a huge range of stakeholders to the table and can be framed whether you care about reducing emissions, building clean energy, or simply building the roads and bridges we need to make sure we have a vibrant economy. That's something that's going to have bipartisan support, even if we're fortunate enough to move something here in the lame duck and make a little bit of progress. I think the second thing is competitiveness with China. I'd say the Select Committee on China has been one of the bright spots of this Congress as an area where there's been bipartisan cooperation on how do we better enable American industry to compete with China. We've seen that some in the critical minerals space. We've seen some very recent bipartisan bills in that area, like looking at, do we need a strategic critical minerals reserve? Do we need to improve the way we develop and process minerals here in the United States? That's an area there in the context of that competitiveness with China that's interesting. I think trade falls in that category. I think some of perhaps the manufacturing tax credits in the IRA could fall in that category. So it's much easier for Republicans to come to the table on these sort of market lever issues when it's about competitiveness with China, particularly the populists who really are taking a leadership role in the Republican Party. The third thing I would say is the growth of AI and how do we power it. That's something that's brought, I think, a whole range of tech stakeholders to the table in the energy context and thinking about permitting for the first time. I've been meeting with folks in the tech space who said, we really want to lean in on this issue, but we haven't had to do it before now, who suddenly care about nuclear and they care about fixing NEPA and they care about coming to the table to make sure they can build and grow this infrastructure in the United States. Again, AI has been a bright spot of bipartisan cooperation. We have an AI task force that was stood up by Speaker Johnson and Minority Leader Jeffries. It's a bipartisan equal split task force run by Jay Obernolte, who all of you should meet if you haven't, because he's a really brilliant guy leading in on this area. And I think those are some things we're gonna see no matter what, no matter how the election shakes out. those are going to be 3 issues that get prioritized.
Excellent. Thank you, Emily. And I loved hearing that history of evolution of how we've gotten to this moment where the Republican Party has been on this set of issues where they are today. That was really interesting. Kellie, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you the flip side of the question I just posed to Emily about if there were unified Republican control of government next year, what do you think would be some priorities that would be top of mind for a reconciliation package? And if you have any other items that Emily didn't mention, if we did have a divided government, that would be priorities.
Okay, well, if either party sweeps in November, reconciliation is absolutely on the table. And it's an attractive process, right? Because it's filibuster-proof in the Senate. You only need 51 votes to get it enacted. But it also has restrictions. Not every piece of legislation can get carried on a reconciliation package. It has to have a budgetary impact, and there's something called a Byrd rule, so it can't be merely incidental to that budgetary impact. You can't have anything extraneous. So taxing and spending bills fit really neatly into reconciliation, which is why the Inflation Reduction Act was done through reconciliation, as well as the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Things that don't fit in reconciliation are things like the clean energy standard or changing, legal standards. Just as an aside, if the clean energy standard had been in place, just freestanding already there, you could use reconciliation to go in and bump up the numbers. So if Republicans sweep, reconciliation will absolutely be used to extend the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. That was how it was created to begin with. That's what they'll do to extend it. And with that brings the IRA onto the table, because as Ryan pointed out, I thought it was 4.3 trillion, but apparently the score is 4.6 trillion. And so Republicans are going to be looking for pay-fors within reconciliation, and the Inflation Reduction Act is right there. And again, Inflation Reduction Act was done through reconciliation, so Congress could repeal it or they could claw back various provisions of it. And reconciliation, because of how it's set up, is designed to cut out the minority party. It's designed that way. And that's why you didn't have any Republicans voting in support of the IRA back in 2022. Fast forward 2 years later, Republicans are seeing some economic development as a result of the IRA in their districts and in their states. And so we're seeing kind of a schism within the Republican Party of some members like Garbarino, and there were 17 others that signed this letter to the Speaker, wanting to preserve all or some of the tax credits, and other members, more conservative members, wanting to repeal altogether, even taking back rescinding obligated funds that maybe are not out the door. So again, IRA is on the table. I think the EV tax credits are probably the most in line, but even the tech neutral tax credits, those are big scores. It's over, I think it's about 115 billion with those two combined, so that's kind of a big score as well. The other thing for reconciliation that I could see Republicans wanting to do is mandate oil and gas lease sales. And I say that because Title II of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is something that I worked on in the Energy Committee under Chairman Murkowski, and that was opening up ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to oil and gas development. We did it through reconciliation, and it wasn't considered a new policy because BLM already had Arctic drilling going on, and we were able to tie into that existing program, to those existing regs, and of course we had the budgetary impact about what those lease sales were going to generate for the Treasury. So lease sales fit very neatly into reconciliation. You've got a 10-year budget window for that, so you could mandate 2, you could mandate 4, however many you want to fit in that. I could see that fitting well into reconciliation. But if we're in a divided government, I think the first thing they're going to have to deal with is the debt limit. Don't forget, that is coming up on January 2nd, and the Fiscal Responsibility Act back in May of 2023 suspended it until January 2nd. And so the start of the new year, Treasury will start taking emergency actions. We'll have to see how much cash is on hand, but Congress is going to have to deal with it one way or another. Maybe not the first quarter, but certainly by the second quarter of next year. If permitting reform is not done, and my money is always on E&R, like they fight to the end. I can see them getting into an omnibus package, but there'll probably be more permitting to be done. That could be on the table. The farm bill, if it doesn't get done, that'll be on the table. The highway authorization bill is also up. But another one I think that folks might be interested in is the Defense Production Act. And that has been used by both President Trump and President Biden for COVID relief. And more recently, President Biden issued an executive order under the DPA for solar and grid components and heat pumps and those types of things that can be, you can kind of shore up the supply chain and manufacturing through the Defense Production Act. So that expires in 2025, and I think Congress is going to want to deal with that as well. But either way, there's going to be a lot for the next Congress to do, whether that is via reconciliation or old-fashioned compromise.
Thank you, Kelly. So it sounds like next Congress is going to be kind of wild. I'm hearing that there are a lot of issues right now, uncertainty in the business community, concerns about the future of IRA, a lack of clarity on guidance on certain of these tax provisions, perhaps a battle between TCJA and IRA. There's looming fiscal issues with the debt limit. So a lot to deal with. I would love to hear from our panelists what you're optimistic about, though, at this moment. I want to focus on the positive here.
I mean, I guess it all depends on what you're optimistic about depends on your perspective, right? Like, I use the China issue again as an example where I think we'll get a lot of bipartisan cooperation. But that bipartisan cooperation might look like more foreign entity of concern restrictions on IRA tax credits, because that's something that, frankly, we've seen, certainly vulnerable Democrats this Congress already voting in support of, and we've seen some bipartisan cooperation in the Senate putting out legislation to have some restrictions on these IRA tax credits. So I think when we think about positive or negative, I think we should think about a little bit more about, like, what's the overlap where we can get people in the room who wouldn't normally talk about these issues. And that might be one area of agreement where we sort of say, hey, look, we're not going to repeal these tax credits because we don't have the votes for it, but we do have the votes to limit them and limit the cost, and perhaps maybe, frankly, support the intent of the IRA, which is to support US-based companies.
I am looking forward to an omnibus measure at the end of the year. It looks like we're going to keep the government open at least until December 20th, and then we should have an omnibus appropriations measure. And I just want to remind folks that in 2020, when Trump had lost and didn't want to leave, Congress was actually able to enact a massive omnibus appropriations bill that had the Energy Act of 2020 on it, so ENR got to hitch a ride. EPW had the phase out of HFCs on there. You had a tax package. It was a Christmas tree. And so and frankly, that's why more conservative members of the House wanted to extend the funding into next quarter, because they didn't want to have that vehicle. But that vehicle is going to be available, and that is the vehicle for permitting reform. My old committee reported that out on a bipartisan basis, 15-4. Manchin is relentless. I think we can all recognize that. And he is going to try to get, if not everything on there, some parts of his bill on there, and we'll see some effort from the House with Westerman to try to get some NEPA reforms into a final package as well.
Yeah, I'm also super optimistic about an omnibus, and I'll say the permitting piece in particular. I appreciate that my environmental community friends are not thrilled about the provisions in the draft right now. But at the end of the day, if you truly care about trying to move to a low carbon economy, we have got to get permitting reform done. And it just has to get done. And so I'm actually we've never seen this kind of momentum around permitting in the past. So I'm really hoping that we're going to get to see something done before the end of the year.
Yeah, and I think I'm most optimistic or, hopeful, because Congress was able to pass the IRA when it comes to clean energy policy. I think we have quickly skipped over what a massive impact that has had. To have these credits that, have worked for a number of years, but what limited them was that they were always these stop again, start again, 1 year at a time extenders. When we saw back in the Obama administration, when they gave a long-term credit for solar, this huge impact that it had, and they learned from that, and they said, well, yes, we're going to add some new policies here, but we're going to really, take a lot of these credits and make them, 10-year credits, and basically get full value. And Treasury clarified, for purposes of the tech-neutral credit for clean electricity, that these 0% emitting, technologies like solar and wind and others, get the full value of the credits. So you have 10 years to plan for that. Yes, there's now some political uncertainty about that. I still think those are going to be okay, going forward, if not maybe shaved back on the back end, maybe phased down early. You know, it's unclear, but again, that's only in a red wave scenario, and I think what we've heard up here is maybe divided is the most likely scenario there. And just one more point on this and why it was so historic is rather than only focusing on really the end of the, you know, this supply chain or the end of the energy sort of world, right, of just in providing an incentive for the wind facility itself or solar facility, whatever. I mean, the IRA really tried to focus on the whole supply chain and the manufacturing of the actual components and the mining of the critical minerals, right, and really trying to onshore and bring all of that to the U.S. so that the whole energy ecosystem is more resilient. You know, and we're seeing, again, just huge investments, right, on the manufacturing side, whether it's, you know, battery storage, right, or you know, wind turbine manufacturing, solar manufacturing. I mean, it's all coming here. So I think it's showing that it's worked, right, and you know, I just think that's probably the biggest thing in tax that's happened, and because it's working, I think it's going to be a little bit more durable, right, than you know, even in a red wave situation. I mean, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to maybe just turn to our panel too, because you know, we're talking so much about reconciliation, and I do really think who's in the White House is going to have an immediate impact on what happens, right? I mean, we kind of talked a little bit about this on the regulatory side, but if we had a Trump administration, I could see them just putting a freeze on all guidance projects. They're going to want to take a fresh look at everything. I could then see them saying, well, I'm just going to put an indefinite pause, and maybe do you ever see final guidance on some of these claims? I mean, that would be a huge, you know, detriment, right, for some of these things. We mentioned some of the new, you know, guidance that, you know, Treasury has their hands full with, you know, things like hydrogen, because it's very hard to figure out what is green versus blue versus pink. I mean, gray. I mean, what's the credit limit? How do you get to $3? These three pillars. I mean, it's probably destined for, you know, the court system, right, under the Loper-Bright, you know, Supreme Court decision. But if you got a Harris administration, they would probably keep implementing, right? They would keep moving forward with that guidance. I mean, and I'm really curious, right? And this brings it back to the TCJ and the cost of things, where one of the biggest costs, according to the CBO, of the EV credits is the mandate, essentially, that's been laid down with the clean tailpipe emissions, which is a totally executive action, right, where these car companies are basically required to make more EVs, and that factors into the cost, the rising cost of that proposal. Well, if a Trump administration came in and undid that, which they could do, that's going to impact, right, the cost and the amount of revenue that would be raised by eliminating that credit going forward. So, I mean, do we not think that a Trump administration wouldn't want to have their own, right, executive actions, right, and want to look at some of these rules that, you know, overlap, because I'm the tax nerd, you know, with the tax code as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to filibuster there.
No, that was excellent. I was going to go back on something else, but
Yeah.
it's irrelevant now. Go ahead. Oh, okay. You go ahead.
No, not irrelevant. Your comments are amazing.
I love the dialogue that's going on up here.
So ready.
Did you want to jump in on that?
I was just going to add one thing to, like, I hate being like the person throwing cold water on the prospects for permitting and an Omni and all these other fun things. But Mike Johnson has to win a speaker race in January. Yeah. So everybody needs to be thinking, if Republicans hold on to the House, what kind of a deal can he cut, and how can it show big wins for Republicans? It's not going to be a Christmas tree like we saw going into a Republican minority, because it's simply just a different environment. It doesn't mean that we can't get the good things done in a December Omni package, but he's already come out and said he's not doing an Omni because he needs to do that to win a speaker race. So I think that sort of dynamic of who's in control of the House is really going to determine what the prognosis is for those options in December.
Just to add one more thing, it really does depend on the election results for the fate of permitting reform. I think if either party sweeps, they're going to think that they can get it, and they will be able to get a better deal. They'll think they can get a better deal, so they'll walk away from that permitting reform package. It really only is in play, I think, if it's in divided government, and maybe even more so if Trump comes in, because then I think some of the Democrats are going to look at that and realize that it is actually a good deal. Another thing I just want to point out in permitting that people forget is it fixes that $2 billion problem with the loan program for transmission. That was that was held hostage in the IRA. They didn't draft it right. The permitting bill frees up $2 billion, so a lot of people forget about that in it as well. But it is all going to depend on election results, and I think right now, you know, the ENR, the committee still has more work to do on the permitting reform bill that they reported out, and they know that they do, but they're waiting, like everybody else, to see what the election's going to bring.
All right, thanks, y'all. We're going to turn now to questions from the audience.
Covered it all.
Don't all go at once.
Just being shy.
Oh, yeah, we have a question back there.
Ryan, when you mentioned how a Trump presidency in particular, thank you so much. Ryan, in particular, when you mentioned that a Trump presidency would likely have immediate effects on a lot of the clean energy and particularly the IRA funding and guidance, I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how LOPR will interact with those powers, given that administrative authority has been significantly undermined, and the avenues that a president might be able to use to maintain that guidance and maintain that funding, either way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's sort of an unknown, right? But we certainly know that, you know, post, you know, LOPR, you know, I think there's going to be a lot more, you know, caution, right, and guidance. Going to be very careful that we're going to see to try to stay, you know, specifically within the lines of what if you're the Treasury Department, what the authority is that they've been granted, right, in the statute. I mean, you can see that in guidance that's come out post LOPR, you know, in the preamble, for example, right? There's like, you know, every paragraph is like, we have the authority to do this. We have the authority to do this. Like, please, you know, trust us. Like you can't challenge us here, not here. You know, and I mean, that's always in a preamble, but in my opinion, looking at it, you know, they're I think very aware of that. You know, and maybe some of the rules that are coming out, right? I'm not inside the building, but they may very well have been wanting to maybe do a little bit more, right, or weigh in a little bit more, and have held back in different ways. And there's always, you know, a process between getting a proposed rule and a final rule, right? Where sometimes they're really they're really, you know, strict and tight, maybe less taxpayer friendly at the beginning, but then by the end, maybe there's a little bit more generosity or softening of certain rules. You know, there's also going to be a legislative, right, like impact on this, right? And we think that future legislation is going to be much more specific, if they can be. Well, I think we'll see a lot more, right, legislative intent too, in the form of, you know, JCT pamphlets and things like that to help explain the rules as well. Of course, that can always be thrown out, but I think it helps, I think, when the Treasury Department is writing the guidance. You know, and then, you know, kind of looking forward, right, like, I mean, my comment is really, this happens with every administration or, you know, changed administration, at least when the parties change. Where a new Treasury Department will want to take a fresh look at things. I think that's reasonable. That's always the way it happens, but it naturally just leads to a slowing down of the process. And I think there could also just be a change in priorities, right? Of, you know, limited number of people, limited bandwidth. Where it is if it's a Trump administration, where do they really focus? And I think just at a minimum things would really slow down. But I could also see, things could take, potentially an indefinite period of time, right, to get completed.
Yeah, and don't forget all the lawsuits too, because I think hydrogen, 45V is a perfect example of something where there is a huge divide between the direction it looks like the administration is going in terms of how they're going to implement that and what you hear from, say, Senator Manchin about what congressional intent was. So I would expect there to be quite a bit of litigation when that rule is implemented, and ironically, I think the future of that tax credit could hinge a little bit on whether or not the coalition that supports it is balanced.
Any other questions? Yes, up here in the front.
Hi. Hello? Okay. There was some mention of clawing back funds that have already been committed. I mean, talking with folks at DOE or EPA, anytime they've made big announcements, and we've asked them, could this be clawed back? And they go, once it's committed, no. So I don't know if you can, provide any further detail about how that could happen.
Well, I will say, thanks to being at a very large law firm, we have a very great legal memo outlining this, which I'm happy to share. But the reality is, I think, and I'm eager to hear what Emily has to say, but look, I think you're going to see some of the money, you've already seen some of the money starting to go out the door, and they're pushing, this administration is pushing very hard right now to get as much out the door before January 21st as they can. But the reality is, we very much expect if Trump is reelected that he's going to come in and put a pause as we, and look at every single thing. And it may be that they just slow everything down so that nobody gets any of those dollars and sees those dollars for a very long time, if ever. So, if depending on what Congress does. So I think, again, this leads to the uncertainty that our clients are really concerned about. And, it's just, there are things that they can do under the law, and there are things that they can do just to say, we're going to hit pause, that can also wreak a lot of havoc. But, people need to remember, our biggest advice to clients right now is you need to be spending a lot of time right now on Capitol Hill educating members of Congress and senators on the projects in your state, in their districts and states. They need to know how many jobs are coming in and what it means for them, because if that happens, we need pressure from Capitol Hill to a Trump administration to be saying, like, we need those dollars to continue to get out the door. But
yeah, I would just say that I think the rescinding unobligated funds is like a pet favorite policy idea from the right that never, very, very, very rarely actually can get executed. It's quite structurally complicated. Kelly can attest to this too. But I would note that announced isn't obligated.
I was just
DOE
gonna say the same, yeah.
announcements about grant awards and things like that are not the same as money going out. Signed contracts are very different.
Yep.
But I do think that we often conflate these two things in the media as DOE's announced XYZ amount of money. I tend to think that the end result here, particularly if it's a Trump presidency, is just a delay and a slow of the process. You're far more likely to see more strings attached to future money than you are to see something actually clawed back, because it's just really hard to get the votes for that.
I just want to add one thing too. Our team that's doing federal funding, we now had to create a separate team just to focus on the contracting with the Department of Energy. We now have like 10 people full-time working to try to make sure those contracts are signed before January 21.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap.
Question is around timing. The biggest problem for industry is certainty, and right now, if there's something that we don't have, that's pretty solidly right in the middle. And I do kind of see with tax reform kind of being at the end of 25, kind of as the end of that shot clock. But is that realistic, or are we getting? Because it feels like if there's all these prospects of everything changing, it's hard to invest, and that's going to be really bad for the country.
Yeah, well, we've seen before how even in a unified government, when you have such a big task or a big piece of legislation that's trying to get done, I'm assuming that the Senate's going to be 51-49, 52-48, 50-50, either way. And as we've seen, one vote, Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, or Senator John McCain. When it came to eliminating the ACA, right, that can have outsized influence. So getting everybody on the same page, that may take more than a year, right? The goal is to get this bill done before even the debt limit vote that would have to happen, like the first 100 days. We've heard that from Speaker Johnson. That's
Good
assuming,
luck.
yeah. In a reconciliation bill, you got to do the whole budget process, right? First, you got to vote on that. That's a challenge, right? How much debt are they willing to add in this bill? Are we really contemplating paying for the whole thing? But you kind of have to have a sense of these things before you just plunge down that road, or you risk, right, the whole thing blowing up in your face, like on the Affordable Care Act. But if it's divided government, or any of these, I don't think they're going to fall off the cliff fully. I think if they can't reach a deal, they'll still do a punt on this. but it only kind of extends the pain, for the IRA being under threat and potentially being like, it would still potentially be there's a piggy bank for the GOP, right? It would still be, in a divided government, like some changes on the edges, in play. But if I were betting, I think there would be a temporary extension, as we've seen before with reconciliation bills like the Bush 2001 tax cuts, when they came to the end and they extended it for a temporary period before finally then in 2012 doing a long-term answer.
So I just want to add in the macro here, we as a country are terrible at economic certainty because we go back to these mechanisms that operate on a pure party line vote. TCJA, pure party line vote. IRA, pure party line vote. The things that tend to have certainty and lasting ability to continue and be reauthorized are the things where we actually do some bipartisan negotiating and legislating. And I'll go back to where we started with the Energy Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, both of which were bipartisan efforts that, frankly, when we look ahead to their reauthorization in 25 and 26 respectively, nobody thinks we're repealing those bills. We think, okay, how are we growing them? How are we fine-tuning them? How are we making sure the money that was allocated was really spent? So in some ways, I think your concern in the business community is a direct critique of the kind of red wave, blue wave legislating we've seen over the last 6 years in particular. And it's something that we need to step away from and try to find a little bit more bipartisan compromise if we want to be able to continue and move on policies.
As someone who works at the Bipartisan Policy Center, I couldn't agree more.
Heyo.
Thank you, Emily.
Shout out.
And I think with that, we're going to wrap. If you would join me in thanking my panelists.
Thank you all so very much for that discussion. I think, they always say an expert's the person in the room that knows the most, but I guess we had 5 of them on the stage right now. So at this time, we're actually going to take a brief networking break. It's about until 10:45 a.m., so be back in your seat at 10:45 a.m. I'll also note that because the room is so full, please feel free to fill these 2 tables up front. We did have them reserved, but we want to make sure everyone's comfortable in the audience. During the break, we're going to be showing some special video messages from members of Congress who support National Clean Energy Week. And we're appreciative of their commitment to advancing clean energy initiatives across the country, and we're excited to share those with you. But feel free to go outside, get a light refreshment, mingle with some peers, and we'll reconvene at 10:45 a.m. Thank you, guys.